By day, the picture of a perfect gentleman, but by night, Chips Channon inhabited a world of secret codes and knowing glances. It was a clandestine brotherhood of forbidden desires shared among the Empire's most powerful men, passions that dared not speak their name, buried deep within diary pages drenched in the scent of gunpowder and perfume. Chips Channon spent his life running, and the starting line was Chicago. Henry Channon III was born in 1897 into sheer American industrial wealth. His family owned a shipping fleet on the Great Lakes. They had money, serious, vulgar, new money, but in the stratified world of the early 20th century, American money was just paper unless it could buy European class. Young Henry hated Chicago. He hated the practicality of it, the smoke, the stockyards, the lack of history. He felt deeply and strangely that he had been born on the wrong continent and into the wrong century. He didn't want to be a captain of industry. He wanted to be a courtier. There is a psychological concept known as the changeling fantasy, where a child believes they were swapped at birth and their real parents are royalty. Chips. Channon never grew out of that fantasy. He looked at the rough and tumble commercialism of America and felt a physical revulsion. He later wrote that he was possessed by a purple haze of ambition. Notice that color, purple, the color of emperors, the color of royalty. He wasn't ambitious for money, though. He loved what money could buy. He was ambitious for a specific kind of existence, an aesthetic life, governed by ritual, title, and bloodline. He arrived in Europe after the First World War, nominally part of that lost generation of wealthy Americans drifting through Paris and London, figures like Hemingway or Fitzgerald. But Chips wasn't lost. He was hunting. He had a map, and the destination was the very epicenter of the British establishment. But how does a man with a flat Chicago accent and no title break into the most exclusive club on earth in the 1920s? You have to remember that the British aristocracy of this era was not just a social circle, it was a fortress. It was guarded by invisible walls of etiquette, accent, and shared history. If you went to the wrong school, wore the wrong tie, or held your knife incorrectly, you were invisible. Chips realized early on that he couldn't kick the door down. He had to be invited in, and to be invited, he had to make himself indispensable. He had to be wittier, better dressed, and more charming than the English themselves. He began a process of total reinvention. It was a shedding of skin. The American accent was polished away, replaced by an upper-class English drawl that was so perfect, so cut glass, that it eventually sounded like a parody of an aristocrat. He adopted the nickname Chips, disarming, friendly, slightly silly. It made him sound harmless, and that was the key. He made people feel safe while his eyes were constantly scanning the room for the next rung on the ladder. He naturalized as a British citizen, a move that in those days was a profound declaration of allegiance. It was him scrubbing away the American stain, but ambition alone isn't enough. You need a vehicle. And Chips Channon found two very effective vehicles to carry him to the top. The first was charm, weaponized into a high art form. The second was a calculated use of his own identity. He was a man who preferred men. And in the 1920s and 30s, this was a dangerous game. Homosexuality in Britain was a criminal offense, punishable by prison and hard labor. For the average person, being caught meant ruin. But for the aristocracy, it was different. The elite operated under a code of silence. As long as you were discreet, as long as you were one of us, almost anything went. Chips navigated this world like a master pilot. He didn't have a title to offer, but he had himself. He was good-looking, sexually fluid, and intensely focused on pleasing powerful men. He realized that sex, or at least intense romantic obsession was a passport that could bypass the usual gatekeepers. He didn't just want to date these men, he wanted to absorb their essence. He wanted to be near the source of power. This wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about proximity to the divine right of kings. His most significant relationship, the one that truly opened the golden doors, was with Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. This wasn't just a casual affair or a fleeting friendship. For Chips, Prince Paul was a deity. Paul was everything Chips wanted to be: genuinely royal, cultured, breathtakingly arrogant, and deeply connected to every throne in Europe. Chips's diaries during this period are almost embarrassing to read. They are flooded with an obsessive, hysterical adoration. He writes of Paul, "He is the God I worship." And later, in a moment of profound emotional exposure, he declares, "I love Paul more than anything, even life." By aligning himself so completely with Prince Paul, Chips was no longer just a wealthy American expatriate. He was the beloved companion of a European regent. When Chips traveled with Paul, kings and queens had to receive him. He was effectively Prince Paul's shadow, and the shadow got to enter rooms where the doors would otherwise have been firmly bolted. It worked. Through Paul, Chips was suddenly dining with the Greek royal family, spending weekends with the Spanish nobility, and catching the eye of the British establishment. He was learning the internal language of royalty: who was related to whom, who hated whom, and which fork to use for the fish course. But he didn't stop at royalty. Chips understood the value of hedging his bets. He maintained close, often intense relationships with various handsome, well-connected young men, from playwrights like Terence Rattigan to the titled sons of dukes. He used his sexuality strategically. It was a currency in a marketplace where he was otherwise poor. He was sleeping his way to the top, yes, but in the context of the British aristocracy, that was simply good networking. He made himself the perfect guest. He was always available for bridge, he always had the latest gossip, and he always laughed at the right jokes. He became the spare man that every hostess needed to balance her table. Yet, despite the royal friendships and the perfect accent, there was still a fragility to his position. He was living on an allowance from his parents in America and his own wit. In the brutal calculus of London society, charm is a depreciating asset. You can be the most popular bachelor in London for a season, but eventually you get old. Eventually the invitations stop coming. Chips knew this. He knew that to permanently secure his position to become a true pillar of London society, he needed something more solid than charm. He needed an anchor. He needed an alliance that would make him untouchable. And in the British upper class, there is only one thing that secures a legacy faster than a title: land and money. By the early 1930s, Chips was a fixture on the social scene, but he was still technically an outsider. He was a guest, never the host. He was the entertainment, not the establishment. He needed to buy his way into the foundation of the building. This brings us to the most cynical, calculated, and successful maneuver of his entire life: his marriage. He began to look for a wife, not with the eyes of a lover, but with the eyes of a sniper. He needed a woman who checked specific boxes. She had to be titled. She had to be fabulously wealthy. And, perhaps most importantly, she had to be passive enough to let him run the show. Enter Lady Honor Guinness. Honor was the eldest daughter of the Earl of Vevey. The Guinness family wasn't just rich, they were brewing royalty. Their fortune was staggering, unimaginable. They were a dynasty that had successfully blended trade with aristocracy. Honor was the heiress to a significant chunk of that fortune. She was quiet, perhaps a bit plain by the glittering standards of the flappers of the age. and seemingly impressionable. Chips saw her not as a partner, but as a marvelous investment. His pursuit of Honor Guinness was a masterclass in focused charm. There is virtually no evidence in his voluminous diaries that he was in love with her. There are no breathless passages like the ones he wrote about Prince Paul. Instead, he viewed the courtship with the cold detachment of a corporate merger. He turned on the full beam of the Shannon charm. He dazzled her. He offered her a life of excitement, travel, and social dominance. Honor, perhaps a bit naive, perhaps just swept up in his relentless energy, accepted his proposal. They married in 1933 at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the parish church of the House of Commons, right in the shadow of Westminster Abbey. It was the society wedding of the year. The guest list was a roll call of the people Chips had spent a decade courting. When he stood at the altar, watching his bride walk toward him, he wasn't just seeing a wife, he was seeing the keys to the kingdom. The moment the ring was on her finger, Chips had arrived. He was no longer just Henry Channon from Chicago. He was now part of one of the wealthiest clans in the British Empire. The transformation was immediate. With Guinness money, the insecurity that had dogged him for years evaporated. He no longer had to worry about the cost of a suit or the price of a first-class ticket. He had access to vast liquid capital, and he knew exactly how he was going to spend it. He wasn't interested in investing in stocks or building factories. He was going to invest in himself. He was going to build a stage. He and Honor moved into number 5 Belgrave Square, a massive, imposing mansion in one of London's most expensive districts. But the house as it stood wasn't enough for Chips. He wanted a palace. He hired Stephen Boudin, the greatest French decorator of the age, the man who would later help Jackie Kennedy restore the White House, to transform the interior. They created a fantasy. The most famous room was the dining room, painted in a specific vibrant shade of blue that mimicked the Bavarian palaces of the 18th century. It was heavily gilded with real silver, not gold, because silver shimmered better by candlelight. It was soon dubbed the Blue Room, and it became legendary. This room was a statement. It screamed, "I have more taste, more money, and more nerve than any of you." It was designed to make his guests look beautiful, yes, but also to make them feel slightly small. It was a power move in the form of interior decoration. Chips was no longer the guest hoping for an invite. He was the host holding the golden ticket. An invitation to the Blue Room became the most coveted scrap of paper in London. He had successfully reverse-engineered a life of aristocratic privilege. He had the title. He eventually bought a knighthood. He had the money. He had the royal connections. And he had the house. He had climbed the mountain. But what happens when a man who has spent his entire life striving finally gets what he wants? He discovers that the view from the top isn't quite what he expected. By the late 1930s, Chips Channon was a member of Parliament for Southend-on-Sea, a seat he essentially inherited from his mother-in-law's family. He sat in the House of Commons, surrounded by the men who ran the empire. He was friends with the Duke of Kent. He was a confidant of the Prime Minister. He was, to all external appearances, the perfect English gentleman. But inside, the Chicago boy was still there, watching, judging, and writing. This is where the story shifts from a simple biography of a social climber to something much darker and more significant. Because Chips wasn't just climbing, he was recording. He had achieved his dream. He was in the inner sanctum. And what he found there was not a pantheon of gods, but a collection of deeply flawed, often incompetent, and morally bankrupt individuals. As the 1930s wound down and the shadow of war began to stretch across Europe, Chips Channon was perfectly positioned to see the rot at the heart of the British establishment. He was a fly on the wall in the rooms where the decisions were made, or more accurately, where the decisions were avoided. He saw the appeasement of Hitler not as a strategic necessity, but as a desperate attempt by a terrified upper class to hold on to their way of life. He saw the King of England, Edward VIII, abdicate the throne for love, and he saw the panic it caused in the salons of Belgravia, and he wrote it all down. Every snub, every affair, every drunken whisper. He was building an archive of the decline of the British Empire, written in ink and spite. He had spent years trying to get into the room, and now that he was there, he realized the house was on fire. But instead of grabbing a bucket, he grabbed his pen. He was about to become the most dangerous man in London, not because of what he did, but because of what he saw. The boy who wanted to be a king had become the court jester who knew where all the bodies were buried, and the burial ground was getting crowded. If the first act of Chips Channon's life was a comedy of manners, the second act was a tragedy of morals played out against the backdrop of total war. By the late 1930s, the world was darkening. The storm clouds of fascism were gathering over Europe, and the carefree, champagne-soaked days of the Jazz Age were ending. But inside the gilded cage of London society, the party didn't stop. It just got more desperate. Chips was right at the center of it, and he was writing it all down. Most political diarists write with an eye on posterity, polishing their sentences and sanitizing their thoughts, hoping to present themselves as wise statesmen to future generations. Chips did the opposite. He treated his diary like a confessional booth where the priest was deaf, mute, and entirely non-judgmental. He poured his ID onto the page. He didn't filter his pettiness, his lust, or his snobbery. He knew with a terrifying clarity that what he was writing was radioactive. He knew that if these pages saw the light of day while he or the people he mentioned were still alive, he would be socially annihilated, perhaps even jailed. This wasn't a memoir. It was a dossier. He wrote almost every single day. He wrote on rocking trains crossing the Balkans, in the hush of the House of Commons library while boring MPs droned on about tariffs, and in his silk-sheeted bed at 3 a.m., his mind racing from champagne and scandal. He wrote millions of words, and as the 1930s curdled into the 1940s, the tone of the diaries shifted. The light social gossip began to mix with the heavy metallic taste of history in the making. Chips was a fervent supporter of appeasement. To modern ears, appeasement is a dirty word, a symbol of cowardice in the face of Nazi aggression. But for Chips and his circle, it was a desperate attempt to preserve their world. They didn't just fear war because of the bloodshed. They feared it because they knew war shakes the foundations of society. They were terrified that a new war would bring down the aristocracy, empower the working classes, and destroy the beautiful, ordered life they had built. Chips admired the dictators in a strange, naive way. He saw the pageantry of Nuremberg not as a threat, but as a spectacular show, much like one of his own dinner parties, but on a grander scale. He was dazzled by the aesthetics of power, blind to the morality of it. He formed a genuine, almost romantic attachment to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. In the diaries, Chamberlain isn't the weak, umbrella-wielding figure of history books. To Chips, he was a lonely hero, a saint, trying to save civilization. When Chamberlain returned from Munich in 1938 with the infamous Peace for Our Time agreement, Chips was ecstatic. He describes the scene in Parliament with breathless excitement, weeping with joy as the Prime Minister was cheered. It is a moment of profound delusion, captured in real time. Chips was celebrating the survival of his dinner parties, while the rest of the world held its breath. But the peace didn't last. War came in September 1939, and this is where the diaries become truly indispensable. They offer us a view of World War II that we almost never see, the view from the penthouse. While Londoners were digging victory gardens and learning to identify enemy aircraft, Chips and his friends were trying to figure out how to keep the champagne flowing. The disconnect was staggering. When the Blitz began in 1940 and the Luftwaffe started raining fire on London, the behavior of the upper classes fractured. Some rose to the occasion with stoic bravery. Others, like Chips, retreated into a surreal bubble of hedonism. He describes the Blitz not as a horror, but as a nuisance, a backdrop to his social life. He writes of raids with the same casual irritation he might use to describe a rain shower ruining a picnic. One of the most striking images from the diaries is the nightlife during the bombing. When the sirens wailed, the elite didn't go to the damp, crowded tube stations with the common people. They went to the Dorchester Hotel. The Dorchester had reinforced steel and concrete cellars that were converted into a luxury underground nightclub. There, safe beneath the earth, the bands played, the corks popped, and the ruling class danced while the city above them was pulverized. Chips captures the manic energy of these nights. There was a last days of Rome feeling in the air. Death could come at any moment. A stray bomb could penetrate even the Dorchester. So all rules were suspended. The moral code of the Victorian era, which had already been framed, completely disintegrated. In the face of annihilation, people just wanted to feel something. They wanted pleasure. This brings us to the most scandalous aspect of the diaries, the reason they were locked away for 60 years, the sex. The unexpurgated diaries reveal that the British establishment was awash in sexual fluidity. The public image of the stiff upper lip Englishman, buttoned up and sexless, was a complete fabrication. Behind closed doors, in the blackout darkened streets of London, it was a free-for-all. Chips writes with a voyeuristic glee about the home intern, the network of gay and bisexual men at the highest levels of power. He names names. He describes relationships between MPS, between generals, between members of the royal household. These were men who stood up in Parliament during the day and preached about family values, duty, and Christian morality. At night, they were in Chips's drawing room or in the Turkish baths or picking up soldiers in the blackout. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but Chips doesn't judge it. He revels in it. He documents it with the precision of a scientist. He catalogs the physical attributes of famous men, their bodies, their endowments, their preferences, stripping them of their titles and uniforms, and reducing them to mere flesh. It's a way of leveling the playing field. In his diary, a duke is just a man with needs, no better than the Chicago boy who is writing about him. He describes orgies that took place in the midst of the war. He recounts evenings where the alcohol flowed so freely that dignitaries were passing out on his antique furniture. He tells of a world where blackmail was a constant, low-level hum, where everyone had a secret, and where silence was the most valuable currency. One particular entry stands out, capturing the surreal juxtaposition of war and luxury. Chips describes a dinner party at his home while a massive air raid is taking place directly overhead. The house is shaking from the concussions of the bombs. The windows are rattling. But at the table, the guests are eating plover's eggs and drinking 1921 champagne. They are determinedly ignoring the apocalypse outside. It is a scene of terrifying decadence, Nero fiddling while Rome burns, but in Savile Row suits. But beneath the partying, there is a deep current of anxiety in Chips's writing. He was terrified of the future. He didn't just fear the Germans, he feared the changing world. He saw the war empowering the working class. He saw the labor unions getting stronger. He saw the domestic staff becoming harder to find and more demanding. For Chips, a world without servants was a world not worth living in. He writes petulantly about the inconvenience of having to dress himself or the horror of a cold meal. It makes him intensely unlikable, but also fascinatingly honest. He voices the selfish fears that his peers felt but would never dare say aloud. The diaries also reveal the darkness of his own character. His anti-Semitism, common in his class at the time, is casual and repulsive. He blames the war on international Jewry in moments of frustration. He is dismissive of the suffering of others. When he visits his constituency in Southend and sees the bombed-out houses of the poor, his sympathy is fleeting and performative. He is far more upset when a bomb damages the House of Commons, which he considers his private club. Yet, there are moments of strange vulnerability. He writes about his son Paul with a fierce, possessive love. He writes about his aging, his fear of losing his looks, his terror of being alone. The diary becomes a mirror reflecting a man who has everything: money, access, power, but is fundamentally hollow. He fills the void with gossip, with furniture, with royalty, but it is never enough. As the war drags on, the tone of the diaries becomes more exhausted. The glamour of the Blitz fades, replaced by the weary grind of rationing and grayness. The Blue Room at Belgrave Square, once the brightest spot in London, begins to feel like a museum exhibit from a lost era. The guests are older, drunker, sadder. The laughter is a little more forced. By 1945, when victory is finally declared, Chips is not jubilant. He is apprehensive. The Labour Party sweeps to power in a landslide victory that shocks the establishment. Winston Churchill, the war hero, is voted out. The socialism that Chips had feared for decades has arrived. The era of the grand aristocrat is officially over, replaced by the era of the common man, the welfare state, and high taxes. For Chips, this was a defeat almost as bad as losing the war. He looks around at the new world, a world of austerity, equality, and leveled hierarchies, and he hates it. He feels like a dinosaur watching the meteor hit, but he keeps writing. He records the decline of his class with the same obsession he recorded its peak. He watches as the great houses are sold off or turned into institutions. He watches as his friends lose their influence. He retreats more and more into the past, into his memories of the 1920s and 30s, the days of wine and roses. But even as his relevance fades, his secret weapon remains. The diaries are growing in the vault, page after page, year after year, stacking up, a monument to a vanished world. He knows that one day, long after he is dead, these pages will speak. They will tell the truth about the people who claim to lead the world. They will show the sweat, the fear, the lust, and the lies. The end of the Second World War brought peace to Europe, but for Chips Channon, it marked the beginning of a different kind of campaign. The external threat of the Luftwaffe had vanished, only to be replaced by the internal threat of a changing world. The labor landslide of 1945 was, in his eyes, a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The unwashed masses were at the gates demanding health care and housing, threatening the sanctity of the inherited wealth he had worked so hard to marry into. But while the British Empire began its slow, painful contraction, Chips Channon was busy fortifying his own personal empire. If he couldn't control the country, he would control his immediate environment with totalitarian precision. This period of his life reveals the steel beneath the silk. It was here that the charming American socialite transformed into a ruthless patriarch, determined to secure his legacy at any human cost. The first casualty of this new era was his wife, Lady Honor. The marriage had been a hollow shell for years, a polite fiction maintained for the sake of appearances and the Guinness Trust Fund. During the war, The chaos had provided a convenient distraction. There were always air raids, parliamentary sessions, or emergency dinners to explain away his absences. But in the stark light of peacetime, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Chips had grown bored. He had extracted everything he needed from Honor, her name, her money, and a son. She was now, in his estimation, a surplus asset. The diaries from this period detail a campaign of psychological attrition that is chilling to read. He didn't shout. He froze her out. He filled their home with his friends, his favorites, and his laughter, leaving her drifting through the hallways of her own house like a ghost. He mocked her intelligence to their guests, rolling his eyes at her comments, fostering an atmosphere where she was seen as a dull, pitiable appendage to his brilliance. He wrote of her with a detachment that borders on sociopathy, describing her distress as a tedious inconvenience. When the inevitable break came, it was Honor who fled, unable to bear the isolation any longer. But if Honor thought leaving would bring her peace, she had underestimated Chips. He viewed her departure not as a tragedy, but as a tactical error he could exploit. In a move that stunned society, he sued for divorce and, more shockingly, demanded full custody of their son, Paul. In the 1940s, custody was almost invariably awarded to the mother unless she could be proven unfit. Chips used every ounce of his influence, every connection in the legal and political world, and every smear he could manufacture to paint Honor as unstable. He played the role of the devoted, abandoned father to perfection. He won. The victory was absolute. He kept the house at Belgrave Square. He kept the country estate, Kelvedon Hall. He kept the boy. And, through a complex legal stranglehold, he maintained control over a significant portion of the finances. Honor was effectively erased from the narrative. Chips Channon had performed a hostile takeover of a human life. He had consumed the Guinness prestige and spat out the Guinness air. With Honor gone, Chips was free to construct the domestic life he had always actually wanted. The mask didn't drop completely. He was still a member of Parliament and had to maintain a veneer of conventional respectability. But the curtains were drawn a little tighter. He began to build a household that was essentially a male harem, disguised as a political salon. This was the era of the Comintern, operating at full capacity. Central to this new life was his relationship with Peter Coates. If Prince Paul of Yugoslavia had been the god Chips worshipped, Peter Coates was the priest who tended the temple. Coates was a garden designer, a man of exquisite taste, gentle manners, and infinite patience. He moved into Chips's life and never left. Publicly, he was Chips's secretary or companion, a vague euphemism that everyone understood but nobody challenged. Privately, he was the spouse Honor had never been allowed to be. Peter Coates organized the flowers. He managed the seating plans. He laughed at Chips's repetitive stories and soothed his ego when he was slighted in Parliament. The diaries soften when Chips writes about Peter. There is a genuine affection there, a sense of partnership that was entirely absent from his marriage. But even this love was tinged with Chips's inherent narcissism. He loved Peter because Peter served him. He loved Peter because Peter made him look good. It was a relationship built on the uneven ground of master and courtier, even within the intimacy of their shared life. Then there was Terence Rattigan. The playwright was the darling of the London stage, the man who wrote The Deep Blue Sea and The Winslow Boy. Rattigan was handsome, incredibly successful, and lived a life of closeted torment that mirrored Chips's own. They formed a bond that was part friendship, part rivalry, and part sexual camaraderie. They were two of the most famous men in London, both hiding in plain sight. The diaries reveal the texture of this underground world. It was a network of signals and codes. A specific type of tie, a lingering glance, a reference to musical interests. Chips and his circle created a safe harbor in a country that still imprisoned men for gross indecency. At Kelvedon Hall, his country estate in Essex, the rules of the outside world were suspended. Here, the boys could relax. They could gossip about the handsome new footman or the dashing young lieutenant without looking over their shoulders. But it wasn't just a playground. It was a training ground. Chips had a project, perhaps the most important of his life, his son, Paul. Having won sole custody, Chips proceeded to mold the boy in his own image with a terrifying intensity. He didn't want Paul to be just a son. He wanted him to be a masterpiece. He wanted Paul to be everything he was, but better, more English, more accepted, more powerful. He raised Paul in a hothouse atmosphere of adult luxury. The boy was dining with duchesses before he could long divide. Chips micromanaged every aspect of his existence, his clothes, his friends, his education. He took him to the theater, to the races, to the cocktail parties. He treated him like a miniature adult, a little Chips. The diaries are full of doting, suffocating pride. Paul was divine tonight, he writes, or Paul charmed everyone. It was a form of narcissistic projection. Chips was living vicariously through his son's future. He was determined that Paul would be a cabinet minister, a leader of men, a true blue blood. He poured his ambition into the boy like concrete, and to Paul's credit, or perhaps his detriment, he absorbed it. He became the perfect little gentleman, precocious and polished, navigating the shark tank of high society with the skills his father had drilled into him. But one has to wonder, reading the diaries, where the child was in all of this. Paul was a prop in the grand theater of Chips's life, the ultimate accessory to prove that the Channon line was now firmly established in the British soil. While he was curating his private world, Chips continued to document the public disintegration of the aristocracy. The post-war years were a time of shabbiness that Chips found physically repulsive. The great houses were crumbling. Taxes were liquidating the fortunes of dukes. The world of white ties and tiaras was being replaced by utility suits and ration books. Chips fought against this tide with manic energy. He continued to host lavishly, defying the austerity of the times. He served illegal amounts of butter and cream. He burned coal in every fireplace while others shivered. He wanted No. 5 Belgrave Square to be a fortress of the Ancien Regime, a place where 1910 never ended. But there was a desperation to it now. The guests were aging. The laughter was brittle. They were celebrating a ghost. His observations in the diaries turned sharper, more bitter. He despised the new breed of politician entering Parliament, men with regional accents and cheap suits who cared about coal miners and health care. He saw them as vandals sacking Rome. He recorded their blunders with glee, convinced that this socialist experiment would collapse and the natural order would be restored. He couldn't see or refused to see that the pendulum had swung permanently. Yet amidst the snobbery, he captured something profound, the grief of a class realizing it is obsolete. He writes movingly of selling off family silver, of closing up wings of great houses because they couldn't afford the heating, of old friends dying in reduced circumstances. He chronicles the funeral of the British Empire, one estate sale at a time, and he never stopped watching the royal family. The drama of the Windsors remained his favorite soap opera. He had been close to the Duke of Kent, and he maintained a fascination with the exiled Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII. He saw in them the ultimate victims of the modern world, royalty stripped of power, left to wander the globe like high-class refugees. He identified with them. He too felt like a king in exile, even as he sat in the House of Commons. One of the most revealing threads in the post-war diaries is his complex relationship with his own American roots. The more English he became, the more he seemed to loathe the country of his birth. He viewed America's rise as a superpower with suspicion. It was too loud, too raw, too democratic. He famously wrote that the Americanization of Europe was a tragedy. It is a supreme irony. The boy from Chicago who spent his life running away from America was now watching America conquer the world, bringing with it the very culture of commerce and mass consumption he despised. He was a man trapped between two continents, belonging fully to neither. As the 1950s dawned, a new element entered the diaries: mortality. The friends who had danced through the 20s and survived the Blitz began to drop away. Heart attacks, strokes, liver failure. The toll of decades of rich food and heavy drinking began to come due. Chips, a hypochondriac at the best of times, watched his own health with obsessive dread. He cataloged his aches and pains with the same detail he gave to a royal wedding. But even as his body slowed, his pen didn't. If anything, he wrote with more urgency. He knew he was the last chronicler of a dying breed. He felt a duty to the future to record the texture of this vanishing life. He described the specific way a footman should pour wine, the exact seating protocol for a sterile luncheon, the nuanced insults exchanged between rival hostesses. He was preserving a civilization in amber. He also began to worry about the diaries themselves. What would happen to them? He knew they were dangerous. He knew they contained libel, treason, and filth. A lesser man might have burned them. A man concerned with his reputation as a nice chap would certainly have destroyed them. But Chips was possessed by a colossal ego. He believed his life was a work of art, and the diaries were the documentation of that masterpiece. To destroy them would be suicide. So, he made his plans. He began to organize the volumes, ensuring their safety. He was setting the timer on the bomb. He looked at his son, Paul, now growing into a young man, and perhaps wondered if the diaries would one day destroy him too. But the urge to be heard, the urge to scream the truth from beyond the grave, was stronger than his protective instinct. In the final years, the court of King Chips at Belgrave Square grew quieter. The blue room still shimmered, but the shadows in the corners were longer. He sat at the head of the table, the dye in his hair a little too dark, the makeup on his face a little too thick, holding court for a diminishing audience. He was a creature of the past, preserved in champagne and venom. He had won the game of social climbing. He had the knighthood. He became Sir Henry in 1957, a final bauble he chased with pathetic desperation. He had the money. He had the house. But as he looked around the table at the sycophants and the ghosts, one question seemed to hang in the air, unasked but ever present. Was it worth it? The answer, scrawled across thousands of pages of his secret life, was a complicated, resounding yes and a terrified no. He had bought the ticket, taken the ride, and now, as the lights began to dim, he was furiously writing the review. The show was almost over, but the critique would last forever. The 1950s arrived in London, not with a roar, but with a strange suspended silence, like the breath taken before a plunge. For Sir Henry Chips Channon, this new decade was a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. The austerity of the immediate post-war years was fading, replaced by a burgeoning modernity that he found deeply suspicious. Rock and roll was bubbling up from across the Atlantic. The welfare state was firmly entrenched, and the rigid social hierarchies he had spent his life climbing were beginning to dissolve into the fluid, messy meritocracy of the mid-20th century. Yet in the twilight of his life, Chips was not ready to leave the stage. He was determined to play his role until the curtain fell, even if the audience was starting to look at their watches. The crowning moment of this era, and perhaps the last great pageant of the world Chips loved was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. It was a spectacle of medieval grandeur, a reaffirmation of the divine right of kings in an age of nuclear weapons. Chips, naturally, was in the thick of it. He describes the event in his diaries with his trademark mixture of awe and cynicism. He loved the gold coaches, the ermine robes, and the peers of the realm gathering in Westminster Abbey like a flock of rare, dying birds. But he also saw the cracks. He noted the cheap fabrics hidden under the velvet, the plastic chairs mixed in with the antique thrones, and the fact that the vast majority of the cheering crowds were eating Spam sandwiches. He realized with a pang of melancholic clarity that he was watching a reenactment of a power that no longer really existed. The British Empire was now a memory, and the aristocracy was just a costume department. But if the world was shrinking, Chips's personal ambition remained swollen and inflamed. There was one final prize he had yet to secure, one last stamp of approval that would validate his entire existence: a title. He didn't just want to be Mr. Channon MP. He wanted to be a lord. He wanted a peerage. For years, he lobbied for it with a shamelessness that embarrassed even his closest friends. He badgered prime ministers. He dropped hints to the royal household, and he donated lavishly to the Conservative Party. In his mind, a peerage was the only thing that could erase the stain of Chicago forever. It would mean that his son, Paul, would inherit a title, cementing the Channon name in the history books alongside the ancient families he worshipped. The tragedy, and there is a pathetic, deeply human tragedy here, is that he never got it. The peerage, the seat in the House of Lords, eluded him. The establishment he had courted so assiduously knew exactly who he was. They drank his champagne, they laughed at his jokes, they slept in his guest rooms. But they never quite forgot that he was, at his core, a climber. They withheld the ultimate prize. In 1957, just a year before his death, he was thrown a crumb. He was given a knighthood. He became Sir Henry Channon. It was an honor, certainly, but for a man who dreamed of being Lord Kelvedon, it felt like a consolation prize. Yet, he grasped it with both hands. He loved the sound of Sir Henry. He made sure everyone used it. It was the final layer of lacquer on the shell he had built around himself. While he chased titles, his physical vessel was failing. The decades of excess, the 7-course meals, the rivers of champagne, the late nights, the stress of living a double life began to collect their debt. Chips had always been a hypochondriac, fussing over minor ailments, but now the sickness was real. He grew bloated and breathless. His heart, which he had metaphorically hardened against so many people, was literally giving out. But he refused to slow down. To stop moving was to admit that the party was over, and Chips Channon was terrified of the silence. He continued to host, though the events took on a frantic, feverish quality. At his country estate, Kelvedon Hall, he created a hermetically sealed paradise. With Peter Coates, his devoted companion, and the brilliant gardener who designed the grounds, Chips built a world where it was always 1925. The gardens were manicured to perfection. The footmen were handpicked for their looks as much as their service, and the guest list was rigorously curated. It was at Kelvedon that the relationship between Chips, Peter, and Paul played out its final complex act. Peter Coates was the glue holding the household together. He nursed Chips, managed his moods, and smoothed over the cracks in his personality. In the diaries, Chips's affection for Peter is undeniable, yet he still treated him with the proprietary air of an employer. Peter was his creature, his creation. And then there was Paul. The boy was now a young man, and Chips's obsession with him had metastasized into a terrifying ambition. Chips was determined that Paul would succeed where he had failed. Paul would be the statesman, the serious politician, the cabinet minister. Chips used his knighthood and his influence to pave the road for his son. In a move that bordered on nepotism, Chips orchestrated things so that Paul would inherit his parliamentary seat in Southend. It was a dynastic transfer of power that belonged in the 18th century, not the 1950s, but Chips made it happen. He was living vicariously through his son's blood, pushing him onto the stage even as he himself was being dragged into the wings. The end came in October 1958. Chips was only 61 years old, but he had lived 3 lifetimes in that span. He died in a London hospital, far from the blue dining room and the manicured gardens of Kelvedon. It was a relatively quiet end for a man who had lived so loudly. The obituaries were polite, describing him as a colorful character, a noted host, and a minor politician. They mentioned his American roots and his English manners. They called him a socialite. It was the very word he hated most, implying a life of frivolity and surface. The establishment he had spent his life wooing wrote him off as a lightweight, a court jester who had amused them for a season and then passed away. They had no idea. As the mourners gathered for the memorial service at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the same church where he had married the Guinness heiress 25 years earlier, they thought they were burying Sir Henry Channon. They didn't realize they were burying a surveillance device. Immediately after his death, the real drama began. It took place not in the public eye, but in the quiet, dusty rooms of lawyers and executors. The question was what to do with the diaries. There were 60 volumes, millions of words. They were stacked in cabinets, a physical manifestation of Chips's obsession. Peter Coates and Paul Channon were the primary custodians of this legacy, and they faced a terrifying dilemma. They knew what was in those pages. They knew about the descriptions of the royal family that bordered on treason. They knew about the explicit details of homosexual affairs that could ruin the reputations of living politicians, dukes, and war heroes. They knew about the venomous insults directed at the very people who were currently sending condolence flowers. If the diaries were published in 1958, the resulting explosion would have been nuclear. Paul's budding political career would have been incinerated instantly. The Channon name would have been mud. Peter Coates would have been pariah. The legal libel suits alone would have bankrupted the estate. But they also knew that these books were Chips's soul. They were his masterpiece. To destroy them would be to kill him a second time. Chips himself had left instructions. He knew the danger. He had mandated that they be preserved but sealed. He wanted them to be given to the British Museum, later the British Library, but with a strict embargo. They were to be locked away unread by the public for 60 years. The arrogance of that number is staggering. 60 years. Chips was betting that by 2018 the world would have changed enough to handle the truth. He was betting that the people he wrote about would be dead, their children would be dead, and he would be history rather than scandal. He was playing the long game. So, the deal was done. The heavy leather-bound volumes were packed into boxes. They were transported from the luxury of Belgrave Square to the cool, climate-controlled vaults of the British Museum. The doors were shut. The lock was turned. For the next half-century, Chips Channon became a ghost story in British high society. Everyone knew the diaries existed. People whispered about them at dinner parties. Wait until Chips's diaries come out, they would say when a famous name was mentioned. The diaries became a mythical object, a Pandora's box resting beneath London, ticking away the decades. Occasionally, a sanitized, heavily censored version was released, the Baura edition in the 1960s. It was a harmless, charming little book that reinforced the idea of Chips as a witty, harmless fop. It was a decoy. It allowed the establishment to relax, to think that perhaps the rumors of the diary's explosive nature were exaggerated. But in the dark, the ink remained fresh. The descriptions of the orgies during the Blitz, the mockery of Neville Chamberlain, the lust for the guardsmen, the contempt for the poor, it was all there, waiting. As the years rolled by, the world outside the vault changed beyond recognition. The sexual revolution of the 1960s made Chips's private life seem less criminal, though no less scandalous for a man of his station. The deference to the royal family collapsed in the 1990s with the War of the Waleses. The aristocracy continued its slow slide into irrelevance. Paul Channon, the divine son, fulfilled his father's dream. He became a cabinet minister under Margaret Thatcher. He lived a life of public service, always with the shadow of those boxes in the library hanging over him. He died in 2007, 11 years before the embargo was set to lift. One has to wonder if he felt a sense of relief that he would never have to explain his father's words to a television camera. Peter Coates lived on as a celebrated garden designer, the keeper of the flame, until his death in 1990. He never betrayed the full extent of what was in the books. He kept the secrets of the Blue Room to the grave, and so Sir Henry Channon lay in his grave, and his diaries lay in their vault. The two remained separated by death and silence. The Chicago boy had pulled off his greatest trick. He had made himself immortal by becoming a secret. He had ensured that he would not be forgotten, because he was the man holding the grenade. And as the 21st century arrived and the date of the unsealing approached, historians and biographers began to sharpen their knives. The time bomb was about to go off. The year 2018 arrived, and in the quiet, climate-controlled vaults of the British Library, a metaphorical clock finally struck midnight. The 60-year embargo, the time lock that Sir Henry Chips Channon had set upon his own legacy, expired. For decades, historians had known the Channon diaries were there, sitting like unexploded ordnance beneath the streets of London. They knew that the published version from the 1960s was a sanitized, Bowdlerized fragment, stripped of all the dangerous parts. But nobody knew exactly how big the explosion would be. When the boxes were finally brought up from the dark and opened, even the most cynical archivists were stunned. Inside were not just a few notebooks, but a monumental wall of text, millions of words, scrawled in Channon's distinct hand, covering almost every day of his adult life. It was one of the most comprehensive, detailed, and uninhibited accounts of the 20th century ever written. The task of editing this Leviathan fell to the historian Simon Heffer, who spent years transcribing and annotating the material. When the first volume of the Unexpurgated Diaries was finally published in 2021, the reaction was instantaneous. The ghost of Chips Channon didn't just walk back into the room. He kicked the door off its hinges and smashed the furniture. The reviews were a mixture of awe and revulsion. The Guardian called it wicked, entertaining, and deeply shocking. The Times called him a diarist of genius. But beyond the literary praise, there was a sense of historical vertigo. Because what Chips had written forced a total reevaluation of the British ruling class during its final act. We often look back at the 1930s and 40s through the lens of nostalgia, the keep calm and carry on spirit, the stoic king, the heroic Churchill. Chips took a sledgehammer to that lens. The diaries revealed that the great British establishment was, in private, a feral pit of vipers. The first thing that shocked the modern readers was the sheer density of the sexual network. The rumors about the home intern were no longer rumors. They were documented fact. Chips named names. He detailed the intricate web of affairs between cabinet ministers, royal dukes, and society figures with a casual frankness that made the Profumo affair look like a tea party. He showed that the laws of the land, laws that imprisoned ordinary men for homosexuality, simply did not apply to the people who made them. It was a portrait of a class that believed itself to be above morality, a separate species entitled to different rules. Then there was the politics. The unexpurgated diaries destroyed the last lingering defenses of the appeasement movement. For years, some historians had argued that Neville Chamberlain and his supporters were merely naive or buying time for rearmament. Chips's diaries revealed a much darker truth. He and his circle didn't just want to avoid war. They actively preferred the company of the fascists to the socialists. They admired the order of Nazi Germany. They were anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, and deeply suspicious of their own people. Chips captures the terrified narcissism of an elite that would rather see Europe burn than lose their country estates. He exposes the fact that a significant portion of the British aristocracy was effectively waiting to welcome a German occupation if it meant they could keep their servants. But perhaps the most damaging revelation was the portrait of Chips himself. In the sanitized 1960s version, he appeared as a slightly silly, harmless snob. In the full diaries, he is revealed as a complex, often monstrous figure. His cruelty to his wife, Honor, is laid bare in excruciating detail. He writes about his coldness toward her with a sociopathic detachment that chills the blood. His vanity is boundless. He records every compliment he ever received, every time someone told him he looked young, every time he felt he was the center of attention. It is a study in profound insecurity. Yet, amidst the venom and the vanity, there is undeniable genius. Chips Channon failed at everything he set out to do in his public life. He was a mediocre politician who never held high office. He was a husband who destroyed his marriage. He was a social climber who was never fully accepted by the people he courted. But he succeeded at the one thing he kept secret. He was a writer of devastating power. He possessed what the novelist Henry James called the vision of the observer. Because he was an outsider, an American, a gay man in a straight world, a new money boy in an old money town, he saw things that the insiders missed. He noticed the fraying cuffs on a duke's shirt. He noticed the nervous tick in a prime minister's eye. He noticed the desperation behind the laughter at the cocktail parties. He captured the texture of the age, the smell of the beeswax, the taste of the cold soup, the sound of the air raid sirens mixing with the jazz band. The publication of the diaries in the 2000s accomplished what Chips had spent his entire life trying to achieve. It made him essential. You can no longer write a history of 20th century Britain without quoting Chips Channon. He has displaced the people he worshipped. When we want to know what it felt like to be in the House of Commons on the day war was declared, we don't read Churchill, we read Chips. When we want to know what the abdication crisis really felt like in the drawing rooms of London, we turn to Chips. He has become the lens through which we view his era. The kings and queens he fawned over are now largely remembered because he wrote about them. He has captured them in his amber, frozen forever in his gaze. There is a profound irony in this legacy. Chips spent his life desperate to be one of them. He adopted their accent, wore their clothes, and mimicked their prejudices. He wanted to be an English gentleman, but his diaries are the ultimate act of betrayal against that class. An English gentleman does not kiss and tell. An English gentleman keeps the secrets of the club. Chips not only told the secrets, he shouted them. He exposed the pettiness, the stupidity, and the rot of the aristocracy to the common man. In the end, the social climber became the whistleblower. The diaries also serve as a timeless warning about the nature of ambition. Chips Channon achieved everything a social climber could dream of. He married the heiress, bought the mansion, and dined with kings. And yet, the diaries scream with unhappiness. He is constantly anxious, constantly feeling slighted, constantly terrified of losing his position. He fills his life with objects, Fabergé boxes, silver plate, expensive furniture, trying to plug the hole in his soul, but it is never enough. The purple haze of ambition that drove him from Chicago to London led him not to a mountaintop, but to a gilded cage of his own making. We see a man who is surrounded by hundreds of friends, but is fundamentally alone. He trusts no one but his diary. He performs for the world wearing his charm like a suit of armor, and only takes it off when he is alone in his room with his pen. The tragedy of Chips Channon is the tragedy of anyone who believes that external validation can fix internal brokenness. He thought that if he could just get the right invitation, the right title, the right seat at the table, he would finally feel whole. He never did. And yet, we cannot dismiss him. It is easy to hate Chips Channon. He was a snob, an anti-Semite, and a sycophant. But it is impossible not to be mesmerized by him. He had the courage to write down the ugly truth about himself and his world. Most people lie to their diaries. They write the version of themselves they want to be. Chips wrote the version he was. He recorded his own cowardice, his own spite, his own lust. There's a strange bravery in that total lack of self-censorship. As the dust settles on the publication of the final volumes, Chips Channon stands as a unique figure in history. He is the ultimate insider-outsider. He is the spy in the house of love. He is the man who bought the British aristocracy, found it wanting, and sold it out for the price of immortality. The Blue Room at Belgrave Square is long gone. The house is now an office building. The Channon bloodline has merged and faded into the tapestry of modern Britain. The parties, the noise, the champagne, it has all evaporated. But the voice remains. Open the diaries to any page, and he is there. You can hear the drawl. You can smell the cigar smoke. You can feel the anxiety radiating off the page. What a day, he writes. What a life. He wanted to be a player on the stage of history. He ended up being something much more powerful. He was the audience, the critic, and the camera, all rolled into one. He sat in the front row of the 20th century, and he didn't blink. And because he didn't blink, we can now see the past exactly as it was. Beautiful, terrible, and irretrievably lost. The story of Sir Henry Chips Channon is not just a biography of a man. It is an autopsy of an empire conducted by the one man who loved it enough to kill it. The climb is over. The diaries are open. And finally, after a century of striving, the boy from Chicago has the last word.